Jasmine Crockett shattered the myth that fame is untouchable. But what exactly did Jasmine Crockett do that shook the pillars of power across America? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The federal courtroom in Lower Manhattan did not look like a movie set, but for Robert De Niro, it might as well have been his final scene. Gone was the swagger, the smirk, the magnetic rage that once lit up screens from Taxi Driver to Raging Bull. What sat in front of Judge Margaret Ellis now was not an icon, but a man in a crumpled silver suit, fingers twitching, eyes searching the polished oak floor like it held the script he had forgotten. Cameras weren't following him this time. They were documenting a collapse, his shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of every word he'd ever weaponized. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but none louder than the silence between his trembling breaths. This wasn't an ambush. It was a reckoning. And the person sitting across from him at the plaintiff's table, calm, poised, eyes like locked radar, was not a studio executive or political pundit. It was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The road to that courtroom didn't begin with a lawsuit. It began with a broadcast. One stage, two names, and a single moment of arrogance that turned televised drama into legal warfare. The studio lights of the spotlight burned white hot, turning the set into a battlefield disguised as a talk show. Every seat in the audience was filled. Activists, celebrities, politicos, and the ever-watchful eyes of America waiting on the edge of their living rooms. On one side of the stage sat Jasmine Crockett, unshaken and razor-sharp in a cobalt blazer, her hands folded, eyes forward. Across from her, in all black with an air of worn defiance, Robert De Niro leaned back in his chair, like a king forced to share the throne. The host, Alex Harper, loved this tension. He fed off it, and tonight he had struck gold. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his voice syrup-slick, "as someone rising in conservative circles, what's your response to critics who say your words endanger free discourse?" Jasmine leaned forward slightly, voice steady, precise. Free speech doesn't mean speech without consequence, and it certainly doesn't mean surrendering our national conversation to media monopolies who choose what truth looks like. I'm not here to parrot talking points. I'm here because millions of Americans, black, white, forgotten, and ridiculed, are tired of being spoken over by the same elite circles pretending to know better. A few polite claps echoed from the right side of the room, but De Niro's jaw was already tight. His fingers tapped the chair arm, rhythm building like a fuse being lit. Harper turned toward him with a baited smirk. "Mr. De Niro, care to respond?" De Niro didn't wait. He leaned in, too far, his voice slicing across the room like a blade dressed in velvet. "Let's not pretend here," he said, his tone thick with contempt. "She's not speaking for Americans. She's speaking for Trump, for division. She's a puppet dressed in patriotism. That's what scares me. Young faces like hers, reading scripts written by dangerous men. She's not just wrong, she's a threat to democracy." The gasp in the studio was immediate, audible, like someone had shattered glass in the middle of church. Cameras zoomed in. Jasmine's face did not flinch. Her expression didn't crack, but in her eyes something shifted. A note of cold clarity, a line crossed. The host's attempt to move on failed instantly. The audience had split itself in half. Shouts of, "Let her respond," clashed with cheers of, "Speak the truth, De Niro." The temperature rose so quickly it was almost physical. The air felt heavier. Jasmine lifted one hand, not to interrupt, but to signal calm. "I expected disagreement," she said, measured, but edged in steel. "But not personal slander from a man who's made a career pretending to be someone he's not. You want to call me a puppet? At least I'm not reading from a script that hasn't been relevant since 1974. I was elected. You were cast. Don't confuse the two." Her words detonated with the force of a courtroom verdict. Somewhere in the studio, someone shouted, "Say it again!" But the louder noise came from the far left section of the crowd, De Niro's fans, who booed as if on cue. The host tried again to steer the show, but the wheel was gone. The narrative now had a life of its own, and it was spiraling. De Niro's face flushed, not with embarrassment, but the kind of heat that comes when your authority is challenged in front of the nation. He stood halfway from his seat, pointing, not at Jasmine, but through her. "You don't know a damn thing about democracy," he barked. "You ride the coattails of a man who tried to burn this country down, and now you dare to sit there and call yourself a leader?" Jasmine didn't rise. She didn't blink. She let the wave pass over her like a rock in a flood. When the noise died, her voice came back low, direct, and calm enough to sting. "Your generation built the fire. Mine is just trying to survive it." The audience froze. It wasn't a line. They knew it. It was a truth too sharp to swallow and too loud to deny. Behind the scenes, producers scrambled. The segment had already gone off script, and sponsors were already texting assistants. But Harper kept the cameras rolling. He could smell headlines. He turned breathless to the camera. "We'll be back after the break." But everyone knew the show wasn't on break. It had just begun. And somewhere inside Robert De Niro's PR team, red flags were being raised with every second. The clip would go viral. The headlines would come. But what no one yet realized, not even Jasmine herself, was that this moment wasn't just a media flashpoint. It was legal ammunition. Evidence, time-stamped, recorded, and nationally broadcast. And it would be used to bring down a man who thought his name was untouchable. By the time the cameras cut, Jasmine had already risen from her seat. She didn't storm off. She walked off. Slow, controlled, and every step said the same thing. "You wanted a fight. Now you've got one." De Niro stayed behind, still breathing hard, still trying to summon something clever, something cutting. But nothing came, because deep down he knew that wasn't a debate. That was the beginning of a lawsuit. What began as a media spectacle had now become something far more volatile. An assault echoed in pixels, headlines, and hate, all targeting one woman who refused to break under the weight of it. The internet didn't just react, it detonated. Within hours of the broadcast, clips of De Niro's outburst flooded every platform. Edits twisted Jasmine's calm rebuttal into bait for outrage. Meme accounts mocked her voice. Anonymous users hurled insults wrapped in sarcasm. On cable news, panelists dissected her resume with surgical smugness, questioning how someone so young could possibly stand up to a legend. But while the noise grew louder outside, inside the walls of her office, Jasmine Crockett moved in silence. No tweets, no press statements, just a locked door, a whiteboard full of names, and one decision that would shift the battlefield entirely. She picked up the phone and said only 6 words. "Get me Sylvia Martinez, right now." Sylvia didn't need an introduction. She was the kind of attorney journalists couldn't decide whether to hate or fear. A woman who once helped Trump survive a political inferno and emerged with her lipstick still perfect. Within 24 hours, she was sitting across from Jasmine in a private Georgetown meeting room, file folders in hand, eyes already scanning timelines and transcripts. "This isn't just defamation," she said coolly, flipping through a printed comment thread. "This is character assassination executed with celebrity-grade precision." Jasmine nodded, but her voice was steady. "I don't care how many Oscars he has. I don't care how many fans scream his name. I'm not going to let men like him destroy young women just because we have the nerve to believe in something." Martinez leaned back, smirked, and said, "Then let's make it hurt." The courtroom hadn't opened yet, but behind closed doors, Jasmine and her team were already building something more dangerous than a counterattack. A case made of fireproof facts and sharpened truth. They started with the obvious, the broadcast. Every second of the spotlight was pulled, dissected, and archived. The moment De Niro pointed his finger, the slur puppet, the accusation of being a threat to democracy. Freeze frames were marked, transcripts were time-stamped, but that was just the beginning. Martinez brought in a team of digital forensic analysts, led by a former NSA contractor named Ethan Cole, young, pale, and always 2 thoughts ahead of everyone else in the room. He didn't speak much, but when he did, he dropped metrics like grenades. Within 4 hours of the broadcast, he explained, the clip reached 3.8 million views. Hashtags targeting Jasmine surged by 11,000%. We've traced coordinated bot activity, and over 2,300 defamatory posts originated from a cluster linked to a Hollywood PR firm. Guess which one? Martinez didn't blink. De Niro's? Cole just nodded. But raw numbers didn't sting in court. Outcomes did, so they dug deeper. Within days, Jasmine's team compiled a list of damages: 3 canceled speaking invitations, 2 interviews pulled from major networks, and an op-ed she had written on First Amendment protections was suddenly spiked by a legacy media outlet with ties to CBS. An internal email from the editorial board, obtained via a quiet whistleblower, read simply, "She's too hot right now. Not worth the blowback." Jasmine read that sentence twice. Not worth the blowback, not worth the risk, as if she were a liability instead of a voice. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence in the room was louder than outrage. Then came the turning point. A single email that reframed everything. It had been leaked by a disillusioned assistant in De Niro's publicity team, sent anonymously to Martinez with the subject line, "You'll want this." The header showed it was from Greg Palmer, De Niro's longtime manager. The tone was casual. The content was deadly. "She's the perfect target. Young, emotional, high profile. You go after her, and every headline will follow. Trust me, it'll make Bob look strong again." There was a pause in the room as Martinez read it aloud. No one spoke. Then Jasmine, her voice a blade, broke the silence. "They didn't just attack me, they planned it." She looked at the email again, as if memorizing it. "They saw me as a headline, not a human." And just like that, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Martinez moved fast. She had the email authenticated by metadata experts, traced the IP back to the firm's own server, and even captured a deletion log showing Palmer had attempted to erase the thread days earlier. "Too late," she muttered, sliding the printed copy into a black binder labeled simply, Exhibit A. Cole followed suit. His team began cataloging replies, likes, and reposts, drawing digital spiderwebs of influence that connected De Niro's comments directly to online abuse. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a tweet. 57 retweets from fake accounts, all within 90 seconds. This wasn't viral. It was orchestrated. Every dot they drew on the map made one thing clearer. This wasn't an accident. It was a takedown, executed with precision, approved by power, and aimed straight at Jasmine's future. And the consequences were no longer theoretical. A podcast host who had once praised Jasmine publicly now refused to feature her. A potential book deal evaporated overnight, with the publisher citing market sensitivity. And even some colleagues on Capitol Hill, people who'd once stood beside her, began to go silent. Not out of betrayal, out of fear, fear of association, fear of the machine that had come for her. Martinez didn't mince words. This wasn't De Niro speaking off the cuff. This was strategic defamation, planned, promoted, and pushed. She clicked on a folder labeled Phase 2 and said, "Now we show the court how the smear became a system." The most damning evidence came from the video archives. It wasn't just the spotlight. De Niro had doubled down during a CNN interview days later, calling Jasmine more dangerous than Trump because she's young and ambitious. Martinez played the clip on loop during prep sessions. Each time Jasmine sat still, arms crossed, eyes locked on the screen, not with emotion, but with the eerie calm of someone watching a crime she could now prove happened. "He knew what he was doing," she whispered once. "He wanted to break me publicly, and now he's going to regret it, privately." What cemented the case was the human toll. Martinez and Cole gathered thousands of direct messages Jasmine received after the broadcast. Some were vile, some were threatening, some were cloaked in fake concern, like poison hidden in honey. One message read, "You're too emotional for politics." De Niro was right. "You're not ready for this world." Another said, "Puppet Girl should go back to where she came from." That one came with a zip code attached. They logged it, flagged it, and added it to the growing folder. Collateral damage. Every message was real. Every name, time-stamped. Every line of hate, preserved. By the end of that week, Jasmine's legal team had enough to not just file a lawsuit, but to send a message. One louder than any trending hashtag, one stronger than any closing monologue. She stood at the head of the conference table, holding the printed email from Palmer like a smoking gun. Her voice was soft, almost too soft. "They think they can define me," she said. "Frame me, use me as a warning." She looked up, eyes focused, voice rising. "Let's make them regret that assumption in court." And in that moment, Sylvia Martinez nodded slowly, eyes gleaming like someone who knew exactly what justice was about to look like. The evidence had been assembled like ammunition, but now came the moment to fire it, on a battlefield where truth, reputation, and legacy would be decided under oath and on the record. The courtroom swelled with tension long before the gavel dropped. Every bench was packed to capacity, the air thick with rivalry and political electricity. On one side, MAGA supporters in navy suits and quiet conviction. On the other, Hollywood loyalists in black turtlenecks and sunglasses indoors, still clinging to De Niro's myth. Reporters lined the walls like vultures with pens, their cameras blinking like snipers waiting to strike. The bailiff called the room to order, and the buzz cut instantly to silence. Then came the sound that split the room like a thunderclap. Bang! As Judge Margaret Ellis slammed the gavel and said, "This court is now in session." At the plaintiff's table, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, her rose-pink suit soft in color but sharp in presence, eyes fixed forward like a soldier who already knew the outcome of the war. Across from her, Robert De Niro looked every bit the opposite, lips tight, throat dry, fingers fidgeting with his cufflink like a man trying to hold on to a role he no longer remembered how to play. For once in his life, the script wasn't his to write. Sylvia Martinez rose slowly from her seat like she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. Her voice when it came was not loud, but precise, clipped, undeniable. "Your Honor," she began, "we would like to enter into evidence the full, unedited broadcast of the Spotlight episode aired on April 17th. Timestamp 2. The truth had landed like a hammer, but the sentence that followed would crack more than silence. It would shatter reputations, unravel contracts, and leave one man alone beneath the weight of his own arrogance." 14. Subject: Mr. De Niro's direct remarks to Congresswoman Crockett. A large screen was wheeled into view, monitors adjusted, lights dimmed just enough to let the video glow with eerie clarity. The courtroom held its breath as the familiar studio clip began to play. Jasmine, calm and clear, defending her principles. Then De Niro, leaning forward, eyes hard, voice curling into venom. "She's a puppet, a threat to democracy." The moment played exactly as America had seen it, but now it wasn't entertainment. It was evidence. Gasps fluttered across the courtroom. A few MAGA supporters shook their heads, muttering. De Niro looked down, as if the screen might burn him alive. The silence afterward was suffocating. Judge Ellis looked up and asked, "Is this the full context?" Martinez nodded. "Every word." And with that, the war for truth began. Not with screaming, but with silence too heavy to ignore. The video had pierced the illusion, but now it was time to strip the mask away completely, word by word under oath, with nowhere left to hide. Sylvia Martinez rose from her seat again, this time with no need for theatrics. Her presence alone shifted the room's gravity. She walked to the center of the courtroom with deliberate precision, each heel strike echoing like a countdown. Then she turned toward the witness stand where Robert De Niro sat, jaw clenched, eyes refusing to meet hers. "Mr. De Niro," she said evenly, "you referred to Congresswoman Crockett as a, quote, threat to democracy. Can you please clarify for this court what specific evidence you base that accusation on?" The silence that followed was brutal. De Niro blinked once, twice. His lips parted, but no words came. Not a document, not a memo, not a recording. Just a man choking on the weight of a sentence he once delivered so effortlessly. He shifted in his chair, hands clenching the arms like they might keep him from unraveling. I meant, it's just how I felt," he stammered, the rasp in his voice louder than any shout. Martinez didn't move. "Feelings are not evidence, Mr. De Niro," she said, her voice tightening just enough to slice. "You made a public accusation that damaged the career, safety, and credibility of a sitting member of Congress. So again, I ask, do you have any factual basis for calling her a threat to the very democracy she was elected to serve?" The room felt as if it were holding its breath in a fist. De Niro opened his mouth once more, searching for refuge in rhetoric, but found only air. His throat bobbed with a dry swallow. "No," he muttered. Martinez leaned in, eyes narrowed. I'm sorry. Could you repeat that for the record? De Niro's voice was barely a whisper now. Number, I don't have any. A single pen clattered from the press gallery. That was all it took. The courtroom was silent again, but not out of respect, out of shock. Then Martinez walked back to the prosecution table and picked up a black binder. Without a word, she handed it to her assistant, who tapped a key on the courtroom's main display. The screen behind De Niro lit up with a subject line, Target, Crockett. Below it, the contents of the leaked email began to scroll, line by damning line. She's the perfect target, young, vulnerable. It'll get us attention. It'll make Bob stand out again. The room went still. Judge Ellis narrowed her eyes, leaning forward slightly as the message continued. She doesn't have the media machine. She'll break under pressure. Push hard. Martinez turned slowly toward the witness stand. Mr. De Niro, she said coldly, is this what you meant by speaking your truth? Is this how you define civic engagement? Coordinated character assassination for the sake of television ratings and public relevance? De Niro didn't answer. His fingers curled tighter around the wooden arms of the witness chair, knuckles white, face drained. A low murmur rippled across the courtroom. One of Jasmine's supporters whispered audibly, "They hunted her like prey." The judge raised a hand for silence, but even she couldn't erase the truth now radiating from the screen like a siren. Martinez's voice came again, unrelenting. You had no evidence, but your team had a strategy. You didn't criticize her politics. You targeted her person, and now, Mr. De Niro, you are here because someone like Jasmine Crockett refused to vanish quietly. The actor's shoulders sagged as if the weight of the truth had finally found its target. There were no lines left to deliver, no applause to wait for, just the unmistakable realization that this courtroom, not Hollywood, would now define his legacy. And across the room, Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, not triumphant, not vengeful, just steady. Her eyes locked on the screen not as a victim, but as a witness to her own resilience. The young congresswoman who had been dismissed, humiliated, and digitally crucified had just watched her abuser strip his own armor away, piece by trembling piece. It wasn't revenge. It was justice. And the room knew it. The truth had landed like a hammer, but the sentence that followed would crack more than silence. It would shatter reputations, unravel contracts, and leave one man alone beneath the weight of his own arrogance. The verdict came down like thunder. Judge Margaret Ellis, voice firm and final, leaned slightly forward and declared, "This court finds that Mr. Robert De Niro and CBS are liable for coordinated and intentional defamation against Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The defendants are hereby ordered to pay damages in the amount of $800 million. Gas rippled through the gallery, followed by a flurry of flashing cameras as reporters scrambled to file the headline that would dominate the news cycle for weeks. De Niro didn't flinch. He crumbled, piece by invisible piece, like a tower whose foundation had been silently eroding. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, but the gesture felt more like an obituary than comfort. Jasmine remained still at the plaintiff's table, her face unreadable, her spine unbending. It wasn't triumph that filled the room. It was gravity. Something irreversible had just taken place. A courtroom had just declared that celebrity did not excuse cruelty, and fame was no shield against justice. By the time De Niro exited through the courthouse's side doors, the fallout had already begun. Studio executives who once jostled for his signature were now ghosting his calls. A major film he was scheduled to headline, a $60 million period piece, was abruptly delayed indefinitely. The official statement cited creative restructuring, but everyone knew the truth. He had become radioactive. A streaming platform quietly pulled his name from an upcoming promotional campaign. A luxury watch brand that had featured his face for nearly a decade sent a curt press release. Our values do not align with recent public revelations. De Niro's team went into damage control mode, but the phone lines were cold. Colleagues who once praised his candor were now issuing vague, non-committal responses to the press. One former co-star told Variety, "I love Bob, but I have to think about my own brand." And another simply said, "No comment." and walked away. The distance grew faster than anyone expected. On social media, the tone had flipped completely. Where once he was hailed as a voice of resistance, he was now labeled a cautionary tale. Posts that once idolized his fiery monologues were replaced by split-screen memes, one side showing his courtroom humiliation, the other quoting Jasmine's calm rebuttal. One viral caption read, "He called her a puppet. She pulled the strings." Within 48 hours, thousands of users unfollowed him. Fan pages turned dormant. A trending hashtag emerged. #Truth broke the legend. Late-night comedians, once his allies, tiptoed around his name or used it as a punchline for canceled relevance. A tweet from a political commentator cut deepest. He tried to bury a young black congresswoman with his platform and dug his own grave instead. Even within his inner circle, fractures appeared. Greg Palmer, the manager whose email had ignited the scandal, resigned under pressure from both legal and industry backlash. Associates whispered that De Niro hadn't spoken more than 10 words since the verdict. One confidant told a reporter, "It's like the fight left him. He thought the world would never turn." A photo surfaced of De Niro sitting alone in the corner of a Manhattan cafe, head down, unshaven, sunglasses on indoors. It circulated without caption because none was needed. The man who had once stood on Oscar stages, defying presidents and waving fists of rhetoric, now sat with the weight of truth pressing down on shoulders that had no script to lean on. Jasmine, meanwhile, refused to gloat. She gave no victory speech, held no rally, and declined every offer for a network exclusive. When pressed by reporters outside the courthouse, she said only, "This wasn't about destroying someone. It was about defending the truth." Then she turned and walked away. No fanfare, no entourage, just the kind of quiet dignity that echoed louder than any applause. Inside Capitol Hill, her colleagues, some hesitant, some humbled, began to see her differently, not just as a voice, but as a force. And in Hollywood, a new phrase started to spread among producers and PR teams. "Don't pull a De Niro." It wasn't just a warning, it was a reckoning, etched in legal precedent, measured in millions, and paid for in the currency of shattered myth. The man once crowned a rebel with a cause was now remembered as the rebel who crossed a line and paid the price. Not with jail time, not with scandal alone, but with something far worse in an industry built on illusion, exile by truth. And somewhere in a silent office, the final press statement was drafted without flair or resistance. Just 7 words, simple, brutal, final. Robert De Niro will not comment further. The courtroom had fallen silent, the verdict delivered, the cameras gone. But outside those walls, a different kind of noise was just beginning to rise. Not in shouts of victory, but in the slow, thunderous rhythm of a nation reckoning with what she had done. Jasmine Crockett didn't hold a press conference. There were no red carpets, no parades, no carefully prepared podiums. She stepped outside the courthouse into a sea of flashing bulbs and microphones and raised one hand. Not to wave, but to stop the frenzy. Her voice didn't tremble. Her eyes didn't wander. She looked past the lenses, past the noise, and delivered just one line. "I didn't sue for pain. I sued for principle." Then she walked down the steps, heels clicking like gunshots against marble, past the phalanx of press who had come for spectacle, but witnessed something else, something quieter, stronger. The statement went viral in less than 5 minutes. It wasn't wrapped in rage. It wasn't meant to punish. But it burned brighter than 1,000 rants, a calm, focused declaration that justice was not about revenge, but restoration. In a world addicted to drama, her stillness became the loudest moment of the day. The letters began arriving the next morning. First, a handwritten note from a retired Air Force pilot in Iowa. Then a folded card from a 62-year-old welder in Pittsburgh who had never voted blue in his life. Then came the emails, hundreds, then thousands. Veterans, teachers, grocery clerks, black mothers, white farmers. A former inmate from Arizona who wrote, "They used to tell us in prison that truth bends for the powerful. You just proved it doesn't have to." The office staff couldn't keep up. They started stacking the letters in boxes, then shelves, then filing cabinets. Jasmine read as many as she could. Some she read twice. And when she couldn't sleep, she would sit under the soft light of her desk lamp, reading through their trembling handwriting, their shaky gratitude, and their confessions of feeling invisible, until she didn't feel alone. Online, the transformation was instant and unstoppable. Within hours, Crockett won, without shouting, was trending across every platform. Clips of her walking down the courthouse steps, head high and expression unreadable, were looped over and over with cinematic music, like she had stepped out of a war film. Edits appeared comparing her restraint to famous courtroom scenes, some real, some fictional, but none as piercing. A 12-year-old girl in Atlanta posted a selfie in her mom's pink blazer, captioned, "Congresswoman Crockett showed me that I don't have to scream to be heard." A young man in Tulsa uploaded a TikTok reenacting her one-line quote with the words, "This is what leadership sounds like," written across the screen. A digital mural of Jasmine's profile with the words, "Not hurt, just right," painted in crimson red, hit over 1 million shares in 24 hours. Without saying a word, she had become more than a victor. She had become a signal. But with every wave of praise came reminders of what she'd endured to get there. Some media outlets still refused to print her name without adding "controversial." Opinion writers tiptoed around the verdict, still calling it excessive or symbolic. One legacy outlet ran the headline, "De Niro pays but free speech suffers." Jasmine read it with her jaw clenched, then tossed it into the recycling bin without comment. She didn't need validation from the same machines that once amplified her mockery. She had something better: testimony. People who had once felt powerless now wrote to her as if she were the only one who ever stood up and didn't flinch. The ones who'd been shouted down at school board meetings, the ones who'd been called too young, too angry, too black. And Jasmine answered not with speeches, but with presence. She showed up to committee meetings sharper than ever. She authored 2 bills in the following month, and she turned every microphone in Congress into a scalpel. Not loud, but precise. The reaction inside Washington was more complicated. Some colleagues still whispered behind closed doors, calling her radioactive or reckless. Others tried to capitalize, posing beside her like lightning rods, hoping for borrowed power. But the most important ones, the quiet allies, the principled outliers, came forward without agenda. One Vietnam veteran senator slipped her a note after a hearing. It read, "They'll never say it aloud, but they needed this more than they know." Even the speaker, who had once avoided the spotlight when she was under fire, approached her on the House floor and said simply, "You reminded them who we're supposed to be." Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was now its own language, one that everyone had learned to read. Still, the weight didn't vanish. Every night, she returned home to the echo of what it had cost her: death threats, canceled speaking engagements, personal security detail, emails from strangers who used words meant to pierce not her arguments, but her skin. And yet she never raised her voice, not once, because rage to her was a luxury the powerful often abused. Her weapon was focus, her armor, discipline. The war wasn't over, but now she had a map, and the country was watching. Not out of curiosity, but out of hope. One moment captured everything. A high school civics teacher in Michigan sent her a classroom photo. 32 students standing behind a banner they made by hand. It read, "We defend truth, even when it's unpopular." In the center was Jasmine's courthouse photo, laminated, framed. The teacher included a note. "For the first time in 10 years, they asked me what defamation meant and why it mattered." Jasmine hung it in her office. Not behind her, where people expect pride, but beside her desk, where her eyes could fall on it each morning before the noise began. And when a reporter finally asked her, weeks later, whether she felt like she had won, Jasmine paused, looked up, and answered without blinking. "Winning is easy, but being right and staying right, that's the work." And the work was just beginning. Her footsteps had left the courthouse steps weeks ago, but the tremors of her victory were still shaking the foundations of industries that once believed they were untouchable. The shift in Hollywood didn't happen with an explosion. It came with a chill, a long, deliberate silence that crept across studio lots, writer rooms, and green rooms like fog rolling over a battlefield that had just seen something unthinkable. A star brought down by someone with no camera crew, no agent, no script, just evidence and resolve. For decades, celebrity had been a shield, a microphone, a weapon. But after Jasmine Crockett's legal triumph over Robert De Niro in CBS, the shield cracked. Publicists rewrote contracts, producers reviewed tapes. A-list actors were suddenly being told to run statements by legal before going off script on late-night couches. One talent agency quietly introduced a new standard clause in endorsement agreements. Client agrees to refrain from targeted political commentary without prior review. Internally, they called it the Crockett Clause, and no one laughed. In meetings once filled with ego and mockery, nervous glances replaced punchlines. A comedy writer on a major streaming show confessed to a colleague, "We used to roast whoever we wanted. Now, one wrong jab and it's a lawsuit." Another showrunner canceled a segment that mocked a newly elected conservative congressman, whispering to staff, "We're not touching another Jasmine." The fear wasn't rooted in ideology, it was accountability. What Crockett had done wasn't censorship, it was consequence. Her victory hadn't muzzled free speech, it had made it honest. And in an industry that prided itself on being bold, the sudden need for caution wasn't just new, it was terrifying. Because for the first time in a generation, power had been forced to measure its words with the same precision it once demanded of the powerless. Backroom discussions in Hollywood became more cautious by the day. PR firms scrambled to train clients on non-confrontational phrasing. Talk show hosts who had once lobbed insults at young conservatives for ratings now reviewed footage twice before airing it. At one popular network, a comedian's unscripted jab at a senator from Florida was cut in post. The reason? Legal risk. The audience never knew, but the joke didn't die because it wasn't funny. It died because the world had changed. Jasmine Crockett had drawn a line, and now everyone else was learning how close they had danced to it. Even casting directors began to notice the impact. A young black actress auditioning for a political thriller was told by a producer, "We're not doing caricatures anymore." Not after Jasmine. The actress didn't know what had happened, but she nodded anyway. The rules were shifting, and her name was now part of the system that rewrote them. But it didn't end in Hollywood. The tremors surged across state lines and political aisles. In Georgia, a 32-year-old state representative filed a defamation suit against a local newspaper that accused him of being a crypto-fascist in a suit. His lawyer's opening line quoted Crockett's case directly. In Texas, a first-term Latina congresswoman sued a network anchor for repeatedly branding her unhinged and dangerous to American values during a broadcast. The case was dismissed, but the damage was done. Networks now held internal workshops titled Defamation in the Post-Crockett Era. Young politicians, especially conservatives and women of color, began speaking publicly about media harassment in a new tone, measured, firm, and legally armed. A freshman senator in Pennsylvania tweeted, "If you slander me for clicks, understand this. Jasmine already built the road." The post went viral, and underneath it, the comments were split, half mocking, half inspired. But the message was clear. The game had changed. The media pushed back, of course. Editorials warned of a growing wave of litigation threatening journalistic freedom. Some even accused Jasmine of setting a dangerous precedent. One anchor on a legacy news network said, "We can't be afraid to speak truth to power just because someone might take it personally." But that was the point. Jasmine had never sued because she was offended. She sued because someone with enormous reach decided to publicly destroy her for sport. She didn't dismantle journalism. She demanded it learn the difference between scrutiny and sabotage. And as that understanding spread, so did what pundits reluctantly called the Jasmine effect. Universities began hosting panels about it. Law schools examined the case as a model for high-stakes reputational defense. PR firms renamed their crisis playbooks. And in quiet corners of America, behind desks, in barbershops, in union halls, people began to say something they hadn't said in a long time. Maybe it's not too late to fight back. Jasmine's win didn't just empower those who shared her politics. It inspired those who'd been told for too long that they had to take it. That if they were insulted by someone more famous, they should laugh. That if they were smeared by someone wealthier, they should stay quiet. Her win told them otherwise. In one of the most symbolic moments, a Hollywood director who had once tweeted harshly about Jasmine Crockett was quietly removed from a speaking panel at a major film festival. The organizers didn't cite a reason. They didn't have to. And across the city, another director, one known for fiercely progressive films, posted a single message to Instagram: "Speech is free, defamation is not." The caption, number sign, Jasmine effect. Even in Washington, lawmakers began to feel the shift. For years, they had watched public figures get dragged, mocked, memed, and forgotten. But now they saw something different. They saw power answer to principle. And many of them, especially the young, the underestimated, the ones who had been laughed at in green rooms and insulted on national TV, saw a blueprint. Not for vengeance, but for justice. Not to silence critics, but to make recklessness costly again. The Jasmine effect wasn't about fear. It was about fairness. A return to the idea that words have weight, that microphones are not shields, that the truth, when wielded by someone who refuses to flinch, is more powerful than any platform. And long after the headlines faded, the verdict remained like an imprint pressed into steel. If you target someone to destroy them, you better bring more than your opinion. Because now, thanks to Jasmine Crockett, the truth has teeth. The institutions had felt the shock, the media had taken cover, and the stars had learned to speak more carefully. But outside those towers of power, something far more powerful had begun. A quiet revolution built on the way one woman refused to flinch. It didn't happen on a stage. It didn't require a chant or a flag or a flash mob. But somewhere between the courthouse steps and the silence that followed, Jasmine Crockett became more than a politician. She became a signal flare for a generation waiting for proof that dignity could still win. Across the country, in schools, churches, gyms, small-town diners, and urban shelters, her name began to surface not as a headline, but as a verb. "Pull a Jasmine," a teacher said to her students in Des Moines when they asked what to do about an unfair grading policy. "You don't scream, you document, you show up, you hold your line." In a rural Tennessee cafe, a waitress taped Jasmine's photo beside the register with the caption, "Loud isn't power, steady is." She didn't need a cult of personality. She had become something rarer, a living reminder that integrity wasn't a weakness and silence wasn't surrender. Among young women of color, the effect was seismic. They had seen it all before: outrage, collapse, internet fury, followed by a slow fade into anonymity. But Jasmine had broken that cycle. She hadn't shouted over her attacker. She hadn't wept on cue. She had built her case, brick by brick, and when the time came, she'd let the evidence speak louder than the slurs. That image, her sitting in court, spine like steel, eyes calm as judgment, was being printed onto t-shirts and posters, yes. But more importantly, it was burned into memory. Girls who had been told to soften their voice, wait their turn, or know their place, now had a model who had done none of those things and prevailed. In a Newark high school, a black sophomore wrote in her college essay, "Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a trial, she changed how I see my own voice." And in that line was everything. But it wasn't just women watching. In barbershops and truck stops, on gun ranges and veterans' halls, conservative voters, especially black and working-class men who had long felt dismissed by both coasts, found in Jasmine something they didn't expect: representation. Not because she waved their flag, but because she stood her ground. A retired Marine from Kentucky posted a video that went viral. Standing next to an American flag, he stared into the camera and said, "I didn't vote for her, might not ever. But I'll tell you this, when they came after her, she didn't cry. She built a case. She proved it. That's power. And that's what this country needs more of." The comments filled with people echoing his sentiment. Jasmine wasn't just redefining how the left saw power. She was rebuilding its bridges to those who had walked away from it. Inside academic circles, her case was dissected like a modern classic. Law students rewrote moot court scripts to reflect her arguments. Professors lectured on her restraint. Media schools added new chapters to their ethics modules, calling her courtroom strategy a masterclass in narrative control under fire. But in neighborhoods far from those ivory towers, the impact was even clearer. A janitor in Detroit emailed her office, "I watched what you did. I've got a daughter who wants to be a lawyer now. She used to be scared of politics. Now she says, if Jasmine can walk into that room and not blink, so can I." The message was printed, framed, and placed behind Jasmine's desk, not to remind her of the past, but to anchor her in the future. The press, of course, tried to reframe her. They called her stoic, unflappable, strategic. They still avoided the word that made them uncomfortable. Right. But the public didn't need labels. They had seen what mattered. That a woman who had been mocked, underestimated, and targeted with surgical cruelty had met it not with rage, but with something far more dangerous to the establishment: control. Jasmine had shown that you don't have to raise your volume to raise the stakes. That real power isn't in the punchline. It's in the pause that follows. She hadn't redefined politics. She had redefined how politics could be fought and who was allowed to fight back. Her impact took a strange turn in entertainment. A major studio exec admitted off the record, "We're not greenlighting anything that makes fun of women in power. Not now. Not with Jasmine's face everywhere." Streaming documentaries pivoted from trashy takedowns to long-form explorations of systemic truth. One even titled their new series, "Unshaken: The Power of Stillness." The opening shot, Jasmine in the courtroom, arms crossed, as the email calling her an easy target lit up the screen behind her. No narration, no music, just that image. Frozen, iconic, permanent. Perhaps the most lasting effect, though, wasn't what changed around her, but what stayed with her. Jasmine never altered her pace. She didn't ride the wave of fame. She didn't trademark her name or chase a book deal. She kept showing up to work, committee hearings, town halls. She returned to her district and sat with small business owners, bus drivers, single moms. When one woman asked her, "How did you stay so calm when they came for you?" Jasmine just replied, "They didn't come for me. They came for what I represent, and I made sure they didn't win." That line was never posted, never broadcast, but it was written down in a teenager's notebook, and one day it'll be quoted again. Because what Jasmine Crockett taught this country, through fire, silence, and a single courtroom, is that truth doesn't need to scream to be felt. It just needs to stand, unshaken, when the whole world tells it to sit down. And when it does, the whole world learns what power really means. The moment Jasmine Crockett walked out of that courthouse, the narrative was no longer hers alone. For days, the media bathed in the spectacle of her $800 million triumph. Declarations of justice, montages of her defiant silence, cable news analysts dissecting every eyebrow raise as strategy. But power, once challenged, rarely fades quietly, and the machine she'd rattled didn't retreat. It recalibrated, slowly, methodically, with the precision of a scalpel, not a sword. First came the doubt, expertly sown, whispered leaks to favored outlets, casting the lawsuit as a political stunt, the verdict as a jury overcorrection, her motives as media manipulation in high heels. An anonymous op-ed appeared in a legacy newspaper 3 days later, titled, "Crockett's Win is a Loss for the First Amendment." It didn't quote her. It didn't need to. It quoted others quoting her, casting her restraint as rehearsed, her evidence as opportunistic, her calm as cold. Talk radio ran wild. One host scoffed, "She didn't sue because she was wronged. She sued because she wanted to be famous." Another growled, "She's not Rosa Parks." "She's Rosa PR." Jasmine didn't answer. They tried again. A leaked memo, conveniently timed, suggested her legal team had received undisclosed donations from conservative donors. It was false, but the timing was perfect. Just enough to throw her ethics into question, just enough to pollute the victory with suspicion. A hashtag began trending. # Crockett PAC. Bots fanned the flames. Cable news fed it oxygen. The public, as always, was invited to choose sides. Still, Jasmine didn't answer. Then came the avalanche of think pieces, headlines that couched character attacks in intellectual rhetoric. Can you litigate your way into leadership? What does Crockett's silence really say about her? Is America ready for a congresswoman who doesn't apologize? On screen, her face was everywhere. In print, her voice was nowhere. She was being rewritten, page by page, post by post, by the very ecosystem she had dared to hold accountable. Yet through it all, she held the line. Reporters waited for her in Capitol hallways with bated questions. Do you feel responsible for limiting free speech? Was the verdict about justice or political vengeance? Some say you've set a dangerous precedent for entertainers. What do you say to that? She never took the bait. She never raised her voice. She walked past them with the same purposeful stride she'd worn on the courthouse floor, the same composure they had once mistook for weakness. And that, more than anything, infuriated them. Because Jasmine Crockett refused to play the villain or the hero. She refused to perform. Inside her office, the world was quieter. Her staff fielded threats disguised as fan mail. A white envelope, no return address, carried a single typed sentence. You silenced Niro. Now it's your turn. Security increased. Meetings were relocated. But Jasmine remained unmoved. They want the mask to crack, she told her chief of staff one night. Let them keep staring. One network anchor invited her to debate a De Niro sympathizer live on primetime. Her team declined. A streaming giant offered her a docuseries. She said no. A podcast proposed a 3-part special titled How Crockett Crushed Hollywood. She declined that too. She wasn't here for applause. She was here to work, to govern, to remind America that the court of law still mattered more than the court of public opinion. But even allies grew uncomfortable. Some Democratic colleagues whispered that she was too polarizing now. Fundraising events quietly removed her name from the guest list. She was no longer the underdog to be uplifted. She was the lightning rod they feared. A progressive senator confided to a reporter off the record, I respect her, but I wish she'd fade back into policy. She's a symbol now, and symbols are hard to manage. Symbols. That's what they called women who didn't fold. Meanwhile, conservative circles were watching with sharpened eyes, not to mock her, but to learn, to mimic, to emulate. A young congressman from Utah filed a libel suit against a network that had called him a domestic extremist without evidence. He cited Crockett versus De Niro in his opening brief. A state representative from Ohio threatened to sue a local paper for labeling her anti-democracy. Legal scholars began to murmur. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just won a case, she'd built a blueprint. And now that blueprint was being copied by people who didn't even like her. One journalist called it the blowback spiral, a paradox where victory fuels backlash, and the backlash proves the reason for victory. Jasmine understood that. She'd studied systems long enough to know that power doesn't scream when it's challenged. It leaks. It gaslights. It corrodes. But she also knew that what they feared most wasn't her voice. It was her refusal to justify it. When Greg Palmer, the disgraced manager whose email had detonated De Niro's case, reappeared in a podcast blaming cancel culture and calling Jasmine's lawsuit a political weapon dressed in legalese, she didn't issue a statement. She didn't tweet. Instead, her office quietly released a public memo. 37 pages, legal citations, court transcripts, digital forensics. No commentary, just facts. The final page bore her initials and a closing line. History speaks for itself. I don't need to. The internet lit up for 72 hours. Then it died down. Because Crockett wasn't a trending topic anymore. She was a precedent. And precedent doesn't argue. It endures. Inside a cafe in Oakland, a group of law students debated her approach. One called it cold. Another called it surgical. The third leaned forward and said, you don't win against Hollywood by yelling louder. You win by leaving no room for doubt. They all nodded, because Crockett had done more than win. She had removed the oxygen from the fire. In her home district, people still stopped her on the street. A black grandmother with tears in her eyes said, you did what they said we couldn't. A teenage girl handed her a folded note. Inside it said, thanks for not yelling. I thought that was the only way to be heard. She kept that one. Because in the end, the backlash didn't break her. It proved she had changed the rules. It didn't appear in the headlines. There was no ribbon cutting, no bill passed in her name. But from the ashes of the trial and the shadows of the backlash, something deeper remained, etched not on paper, but in instinct. A shift, subtle, permanent, invisible to those who weren't paying attention, but clear as day to those who had ever been silenced, ridiculed, or erased. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just exposed one man's arrogance or one network's recklessness. She had redrawn the battlefield, so quietly, so completely, that few even realized the weapons had changed. There was no longer room for drive-by character assassination wrapped in clever sound bites. No more open season on women who dared to speak without trembling. No more dismissing a voice because it refused to perform rage for the cameras. A boundary now lived between rhetoric and ruin, and Jasmine had placed it there with terrifying precision. Law schools began referring to it as the Crockett threshold. Not a legal statute, not a ruling, but a cultural line, a moment that split public discourse into before and after. In one classroom at NYU, a professor stood before a class of first years and said, "Before 2025, we taught defamation as an archaic tort. Now we teach it as survival." The whiteboard behind him read, "Silence is not absence. Control is not cowardice. Precision is not weakness." Underneath, three words: Crockett, Drew, blood. Across the country, debate teams rewrote their code of conduct. Media literacy curriculums included a unit titled Narrative Ethics After Crockett. HR departments at Fortune 500 companies began incorporating reputation management clauses not just for executives, but for entry-level employees. A single email, one clip, one false quote taken out of context. These things were no longer harmless. They were lawsuits waiting to happen, and they weren't just risky for the individual. They were radioactive for entire institutions. But the most powerful transformation didn't happen in classrooms or courtrooms. It happened in the quiet places. In the kitchen of a single mother in Detroit who'd stopped applying for jobs because her teenage mistake kept resurfacing in Google search results. After watching Jasmine's story, she walked into a local legal clinic and said, "I want to know what I can erase." In the library of a community college in Arizona, a DACA recipient read about Jasmine's case and asked her civics professor, "Do I have the right to fight back too?" In a black barber shop in South Carolina, a former felon looked up from the paper and muttered, "They thought they could break her." She broke the game. No, Jasmine hadn't written new laws, but she had changed the cost of cruelty. She had taught a country drunk on noise how to recognize the weight of restraint. That was the line she left behind. A documentary filmmaker attempted to capture it, but failed. Not because he was biased, but because the story didn't bend to structure. He wanted a climax, a catharsis. He asked Jasmine for an interview. She declined, so he followed the people instead. The ones who now saw her as something more than a congresswoman, a blueprint, a mirror, a reminder. The final shot of his film didn't show Jasmine at all. It showed a classroom full of eighth graders in Atlanta raising their hands to the question, "What does power mean to you?" One girl said, "Not yelling." A boy said, "Bringing proof." A third student, voice barely above a whisper, said, "Jasmine Crockett." She had become a lesson they weren't supposed to learn. In Washington, the discomfort lingered. Lobbyists avoided her office. Not because she was hostile, but because she was unreadable. Journalists stopped trying to bait her. Her silence had become something they feared more than her words, because silence meant she was watching. And when Jasmine watched, it meant she was preparing. One senator, older, white, seasoned by decades of procedural theater, once turned to her during a judiciary session and said, "You scare the hell out of this place." She didn't blink. "I'm not here to be liked," she replied. "I'm here to remind this place who it answers to." Outside the Capitol, the words were spray-painted onto a wall in Oakland. Someone else turned it into a sticker, then a t-shirt, a mug, a tattoo. She never gave permission. She never needed to. Some tried to minimize her impact. They said it was a moment, not a movement, that her trial was an anomaly, her silence a strategy, that eventually someone louder, flashier, angrier would come along and take the spotlight back. But they missed the point. Jasmine had never wanted the spotlight. She had wanted the record. And once something is on the record, it doesn't need to shout. It just needs to remain. Years later, her courtroom portrait would hang in a small exhibit at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The plaque beneath it wouldn't mention De Niro. It wouldn't mention CBS. It wouldn't even mention the dollar amount. It would contain only her quote engraved in bronze. "I didn't sue because I was hurt. I sued because they thought I wouldn't." And underneath that, in smaller type, "She didn't win by yelling. She won by never stepping back." That was the line she left behind. It couldn't be undone. It couldn't be mocked. It could only be crossed at your own risk. The line Jasmine left behind wasn't just legal, or political, or cultural. It was deeply, unshakably human. A reminder that every battle for truth begins with the decision to stand alone. The lesson wasn't loud. It didn't arrive wrapped in applause or praise. It crept in during the quiet moments, the ones with no audience, no headlines, no camera crews. It came in the form of a woman sitting at her kitchen table, rereading the threat sent to her home, in the way her hands trembled slightly, then stopped. It came in the expression of a father watching his daughter raise her hand in class for the first time, because she'd seen someone on the news win with silence instead of shouting. The lesson came not when Jasmine Crockett defeated Robert De Niro, but when she refused to let their smear define her, when she didn't cave to the noise, when she stood firm and let the truth carry its own weight. That was the point. Justice doesn't need to roar. It only needs to remain standing when everything else collapses. Because Jasmine's story isn't just about what was said to her, it's about what she didn't let them take. They came for her name. They tried to stain it with ridicule, drown it in ratings, and twist it into a symbol of division. But she held it like a blade, not to attack, but to protect. She showed us that dignity isn't weakness, that calm is not capitulation, that choosing the high road doesn't mean surrender, it means strategy. Her restraint was not silence, it was steel. And in a world obsessed with outrage, where algorithms reward humiliation, that kind of composure is the most radical act of all. The world didn't hand Jasmine power. It tried to humiliate her for reaching for it, but she reached anyway. And when they laughed, she built a case. When they doubted her, she gathered proof. When they dismissed her, she stood taller. She did not raise her voice to be heard. She let the facts do the speaking. And when the verdict fell like a hammer, it wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been told to sit down, be quiet, or wait their turn. Jasmine didn't just win a courtroom. She cracked the illusion that only the loudest voices matter. And that is the human lesson. That truth does not require fury. That courage doesn't always look like fists raised. It can look like hands folded, eyes steady, spine unbending. That justice, when armed with patience, preparation, and purpose, will always outlast the storm. Jasmine Crockett walked through fire and came out quieter, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had already said it where it mattered most, on the record. And the record will outlive the noise. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In the middle of a tense, nationally televised congressional hearing, Marjorie Taylor Greene mockingly and condescendingly called Jasmine Crockett unprofessional, loud enough for the entire chamber to hear. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She raised the stakes. With just a few calmly delivered sentences, she shifted the momentum of the entire room. And by the end of the week, headlines across the country were calling it a turning point in American politics. What exactly did she say? And why did it leave even her enemies speechless? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room pulsed with quiet tension, even before a single word was spoken. It was the kind of room where history didn't whisper. It waited to explode. Rows of lawmakers sat behind their nameplates like immovable statues, but their eyes darted, alert. The gallery overflowed with press, their fingers hovering above keyboards, cameras pointed like weapons, red tally lights glowing with expectation. On one end sat Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, arms crossed, jaw clenched, her presence radiating defiance, as if the entire proceeding were already beneath her. On the other stood Representative Jasmine Crockett, sharp, calm, unshakable, the kind of woman who didn't have to raise her voice to demand the room. At the center of it all stood Jasmine, framed by oak panels and years of struggle. She wore no armor, just a sharp navy suit and the quiet authority of someone who had seen justice denied too many times to flinch at power. Her voice when it came was even, firm-rooted in something deeper than statistics. "This is not about test scores," she began. "This is about zip codes that predict futures, about school buildings with mold on the ceilings and no heat in the winter, where teachers buy their own chalk and still get blamed when their students fall behind." Each sentence carved into the room like a chisel. She wasn't raising her voice, but she was raising the temperature of the truth, and it was starting to burn. Just as Jasmine moved to cite the federal allocation numbers, concrete, undeniable, irrefutable, a voice snapped through the air with the force of a thrown chain. "This is completely unprofessional." It was Marjorie Taylor Greene. She didn't look up from her seat. She didn't need to. Her words were designed not to debate, but to diminish. A calculated interruption, not of fact, but of presence. The moment she said it, the air changed. You could feel it. A hush, like a held breath, rippled through the room. One staffer's pen stopped mid-stroke. A Capitol intern dropped their eyes to the floor. Even the chair of the hearing froze for a heartbeat, hands poised above the gavel but unmoving. The microphones caught every syllable, crisp and sharp, like glass breaking in a library. Green leaned back slightly in her chair, arms folded, wearing the satisfied smirk of someone who thought they just won a moment. But what she didn't realize, what no one realized yet, was that her words had lit a fuse, and Jasmine was still standing, untouched, unshaken, staring straight ahead, not blinking, not breathing heavy, just waiting. And when she finally moved, it wasn't to retaliate, it was to redefine the entire battlefield. Jasmine leaned forward just enough for the mic to catch her voice, though she could have whispered and the whole chamber would have heard her anyway. Her tone was measured, each word wrapped in restraint, but the fire behind it was unmistakable. "We'll address that with substance. No theatrics, no escalation, just a line of surgical calm delivered with the weight of centuries behind it." Her gaze didn't flinch, didn't wander. It locked straight ahead, not at Green, but past her, through her, as if speaking to something older, larger, more poisonous than one woman's insult. She was standing in a room designed to break women like her, and yet her spine held straighter than the marble columns behind her. Around her, the air felt heavier, like the walls themselves knew what was coming next. She didn't raise her hand, but power gathered around her like a gathering storm, and in that moment, without raising her voice, Jasmine declared war on every room that ever told a black woman to sit down and smile. But while Green reclined in smug satisfaction, the room itself began to shift, not from noise, but from eyes. She thought she had landed a winning blow. Her body language said it all, arms folded like a wall, chin tilted slightly back, the smug curl of her lips signaling that she believed she had just reduced a national conversation to a dismissive jab. Her supporters didn't cheer, but they didn't need to. The damage was meant to be quiet. It was meant to be felt, not heard. Somewhere across the room, a congressman in a gray suit leaned sideways and whispered to his colleague without taking his eyes off Jasmine. "She's about to blow. Just watch." There was no malice in his voice, only expectation, the same way someone watches a match hover over gasoline. But Jasmine Crockett didn't ignite. She didn't so much as raise a brow. Instead, her eyes began to move, deliberately one by one, scanning the faces around her with the cool precision of someone counting the seconds before gravity takes hold. She looked at the Democrats who shifted in their seats, unsure whether to speak or stay safe. She looked at Republicans who watched with crossed arms, their faces already shaped into indifference. She even looked toward the aides, young, tired, overworked, who knew exactly what had just happened, but were too junior to name it aloud. Her gaze didn't beg for permission, nor did it plead for understanding. It logged and measured, like a ledger, marking who saw her as a colleague and who saw her as a disruption. In the upper gallery, a young reporter lowered her phone for just a moment. Her breath caught. She leaned toward her editor and whispered the kind of sentence that travels faster than news itself. This, this is the moment. But it wasn't a moment of collapse. It was the moment just before the first drum of thunder hits the roof. Jasmine's right hand slowly reached for the edge of the desk in front of her. Not in desperation, but in control. She didn't grip it like she was drowning. She placed her fingertips there like an anchor. The wood beneath her palm was smooth, lacquered, but solid, like her. The cameras were still rolling, but she didn't look into them. She didn't need to. Her stillness was louder than Green's words, her calm more violent than any insult. And somewhere between the silence and the restraint, something began to shift. Not in her, but in the room itself. The temperature dropped. The air became thick. The kind of pressure that comes before something changes. Not because someone shouts, but because someone doesn't. And in that moment, without a single raised voice, Jasmine Crockett made it clear. The storm wasn't coming. She was the storm. And just when the silence began to feel unbearable, like the whole room was waiting for permission to breathe, Green opened her mouth again, pouring gasoline onto a flame she thought she had smothered. This woman has no respect for decorum. She's loud, unprofessional, and frankly, out of control. Green's voice sliced through the air with theatrical cruelty, each word punctuated like a verdict being read aloud. She leaned forward now, amplifying her posture like a prosecutor making her closing argument. She didn't speak to Jasmine. She spoke about her as if she weren't even in the room, as if she were just an exhibit to be examined. Her tone dripped with disdain, but worse than the insult was the casualness of it, the way it was spoken like a known truth, unchallenged and assumed. The words were meant to reduce Jasmine to a stereotype, to a threat, to the caricature of every angry black woman label ever wielded as a muzzle. Green knew what she was doing. This wasn't about policy. This was about image, optics, power. Her voice echoed not with authority, but entitlement. Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She lifted her chin slowly, not out of defiance, but purpose. Her eyes locked on Green, not with rage, but with the kind of clarity that cuts through noise like a scalpel through silk. The room, already heavy with tension, seemed to stop breathing entirely. No one dared move. You could hear the faint, mechanical whir of the cameras zooming in. Jasmine stepped forward just enough for her voice to carry, not only to Green, but to everyone watching across the country. And then, without raising her tone, without blinking, she delivered a line that sliced the room in two. If truth makes me loud, then maybe silence is what made you acceptable. The impact was immediate and seismic. It didn't shout. It landed, like a pin dropping in a vault, like thunder cracking through marble. There was no applause, just silence, but not the silence of confusion. This was the silence of recognition, of witnesses who had just seen the mask slip, of people who realized in real time that two definitions of professionalism had just collided, one designed to maintain comfort and one meant to survive injustice. Jasmine's words were not for Green. They were for every girl who had ever been told to lower her voice, every woman who had been called too much, every person of color who had been labeled a problem simply for not disappearing. She didn't need a mic drop. She didn't need to raise her voice. She was the voice. Green's smirk faltered for the first time, not because she'd been shouted down, but because she hadn't. Because Jasmine's restraint wasn't a sign of submission, it was control. Total, devastating control. The kind that doesn't need to shout to command attention. Around the room, you could feel lawmakers shifting, not just in their seats, but in their understanding. What had started as a hearing had become something else entirely. A mirror, a battlefield, a confrontation between comfort and confrontation. Between two worldviews, one that polices tone to avoid truth, and one that uses truth as the only tone it has left. And in the center of it stood Jasmine Crockett, still, unshaken, flame-eyed, and spine straight. She wasn't debating anymore. She was dismantling. She wasn't reacting. She was reframing the very terms of the conversation. And the tension didn't break. It crystallized. Because every single person in that room now knew they weren't just watching a clash between two politicians. They were watching a line drawn in the heart of power itself. And just when the silence seemed to stretch into eternity, Jasmine reached down, not for permission, but for evidence. The click of the remote was almost imperceptible, but its effect was immediate. Behind Jasmine, the projection screen blinked to life, casting cold light across the chamber. The title appeared in stark white against black. Unprofessional, a pattern of behavior by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, 2021 to 2024. No embellishments, no commentary, just the facts. The first video began playing, grainy Capitol security footage of Greene jabbing a finger into the chest of a uniformed guard, her voice raised, face flushed, mouthing words that didn't need audio to be understood. The next clip showed her interrupting a fellow congresswoman mid-sentence, loudly accusing her of being a Marxist plant during a veterans funding debate. Another cut to Greene laughing during a school shooting testimony, brushing aside a parent's tears with a dismissive wave. The room did not erupt. It tightened. Chairs creaked, throats cleared. One aide's hand flew up to their mouth. There was no narration. Jasmine let the images speak. Let Greene's own behavior roll out like a silent indictment, more damning than any speech. When the final clip ended, a moment where Greene yelled, "Shut your mouth," during a climate hearing, the screen froze. Jasmine didn't turn around. She faced the chamber, calm as ever, but now there was steel in her voice. Not fury, not revenge, precision. "Is this," she said slowly, "what professionalism looks like to you?" She didn't shout. She didn't sneer. She simply held up the very word Greene had weaponized against her and snapped it in half, cleanly, in front of the world. For a moment, no one moved. The sound of a paper shuffling in the back felt like thunder. Then, clap. Just one at first. From the back row. Then another. Louder. A ripple. Measured but defiant. The kind of applause that doesn't come from politeness, but from reckoning. The chair didn't bang the gavel, didn't interrupt. He simply stared ahead, fingers steepled beneath his chin, as if weighing something heavier than procedural decorum. Greene had gone silent, still seated, but suddenly small beneath the footage she couldn't erase. Jasmine remained standing, the remote still in her hand, but now it looked more like a weapon than a tool. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply let the silence settle. One not built from fear, but from realization. She had just reversed the mirror. Now Greene was the reflection, and it wasn't flattering. Around the room, the shift was palpable. Even those who had rolled their eyes earlier now sat straighter, stiffer. Not because they had changed sides, but because they realized they were being seen, not just by their colleagues, but by the millions watching beyond these walls. Jasmine hadn't called Greene names. She hadn't thrown a tantrum. She had done something far more devastating. She had documented her, named the behavior, presented it with surgical clarity, and in doing so, redefined the entire battlefield. No one interrupted her now. Not even Greene. Jasmine looked across the chamber and let the silence do the rest of the speaking. The message was clear. If the rules of decorum were going to be used as a noose, then she would make sure everyone saw who had been tightening it all along. And as the final slide faded to black behind her, it wasn't Jasmine's voice that echoed in the room. It was truth, unapologetic, undeniable, and absolutely professional. The applause had barely faded when Jasmine stepped forward, not to celebrate, but to finish what she started. She took one deliberate step toward the front of the chamber, not fast, not theatrical, just forward. Her heels clicked once against the marble, and somehow even that sound felt sharper than Greene's entire tirade. Her frame remained composed, but there was something unmistakably electric in the air now, like steel beginning to hum before a storm. She rested her hand lightly on the table, not for balance but for presence. Her voice when it came was low and smooth, almost too quiet for a room so heavy with attention. "You don't fear I lack decorum. You fear I don't ask for permission. The words landed like a flare in darkness, exposing not just Green, but the entire system that had enabled her posture of mock authority. Jasmine's eyes didn't waver. She wasn't appealing to anyone. She was delivering testimony not to the lawmakers in front of her, but to the history she knew was watching behind them. And the silence that followed was different this time, less shocked, more reverent, because everyone sensed it. She wasn't done. She paused, not for effect, but for weight. Her shoulders stayed square, her breath measured. She didn't blink. And then she said, in a voice lined with years of restrained fire, 8 years ago, I was thrown out of a Texas courtroom for defending a black teenage boy who couldn't afford a lawyer. The words sliced the room open, slow, surgical, undeniable. No one shifted. No one dared. Jasmine continued, her tone steady, but something raw shimmered beneath it like molten metal barely contained. They called me emotional, loud, and yes, unprofessional. She didn't flinch at the repetition. She owned it. Behind her, the congressional seal loomed large. But for the first time, it didn't look like a symbol of order. It looked like a cage. Jasmine let the sentence sit in the room like a courtroom transcript that couldn't be erased. She wanted them to feel it. Not just the words, but the burden they carried. And then she said what no record ever had the courage to document. But they didn't include this in the transcript. He was innocent. Her voice didn't crack. It got colder, sharper. And I stayed with him until he walked free. The weight of that line wasn't in the language. It was in the sacrifice it hinted at. The late nights, the closed doors, the stares, the threats, the rejection letters, the voicemails that started with "you people" and ended with nothing at all. But Jasmine said none of that. She didn't need to. Her silence between sentences said it for her. She stood there, black, female, fierce, and unbent, surrounded by the same walls that once would have called her out of order for breathing too loudly. Finally, she leaned in, just slightly, and delivered the line that would shatter the entire illusion of superiority still clinging to the edges of the chamber. If that's what unprofessional means, then I'll wear it every day like a badge. The line didn't roar. It rang, like a verdict being read aloud, like a bell tolling for every black woman who had ever been told to soften her edges, to round her truth, to make her fight more digestible. She didn't say it for Green. She didn't say it for the cameras. She said it for the girl watching from a school desk in Mississippi, from a courtroom bench in Ohio, from a staffer's desk just outside that door, wondering if standing up would cost her everything. Jasmine made sure she had an answer. The room didn't erupt. It froze. It held, like a collective breath no one knew how to release. And in that stillness, Jasmine Crockett didn't just reclaim a word. She rebuilt its meaning, brick by brick, sentence by sentence, trial by trial. She didn't ask to belong. She forced the definition of belonging to catch up to her existence. In that moment, she wasn't unprofessional. She was unforgettable. And the silence around her wasn't absence. It was awe. But not everyone could stand still inside that silence, especially not the one it exposed. Green's composure shattered like a cheap mask under pressure. Her voice tore through the chamber, loud, raw, and cracking at the edges. "You're twisting everything." It wasn't calculated anymore. It wasn't rhetorical strategy. It was panic disguised as anger, the kind that erupts when someone realizes they've lost control, not just of the room, but of the narrative. She slammed her palm against the desk so hard it echoed through the marble walls like a warning shot. But no one flinched. No one rushed to her defense. No one moved. The sharp smack of skin against wood felt less like power and more like a final gasp. Papers fluttered off the table. A water glass trembled near the edge. And the cameras, those ever-watchful cameras, zoomed in on her, unraveling, catching every breathless flinch and twitch of fury in 4K silence. Her voice had once dominated headlines. Now it simply bounced back, empty, off unmoved stone. She shoved back her chair, hard enough to screech against the floor, and rose with the rigid, frantic energy of someone not prepared to be seen, truly seen. Her eyes darted across the room looking for something, An ally, a signal, an exit. What she found instead was Jasmine Crockett, still standing, spine straight, shoulders set, not smug, just steady. Jasmine didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. Her face remained still, but her silence said everything. I don't need to chase you. You just told the world who you are. Green's gaze faltered under that stillness, and for the first time in the hearing, her power shrank. Not because it had been taken, but because it had collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. Green spun on her heel, every step across the polished floor louder than the last, like someone trying to stomp away from their own reflection. Each clack of her heels rang out with desperate punctuation. Retreat, retreat, retreat. Her fists were clenched at her sides, not in control, but in frustration. Fingers curled not around conviction, but around air. She pushed through the chamber doors without looking back, and they swung shut behind her with a muted, heavy thud, like the final page in a story that had ended, not with a triumph, but with a reckoning. Inside the room, no one applauded. No one moved. There were no dramatic gasps, no whispered commentary. Just breathe. The kind of collective exhale that only comes when a storm has passed, not the kind that rattles windows, but the kind that reveals what the wind tried to hide. And in the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett remained exactly where she had always been. Not elevated, not defiant, but anchored. She didn't chase. She didn't shout. Because sometimes in rooms built to exclude you, the most radical thing you can do is stay and let them walk out. The echo of the chamber doors closing behind Green hadn't even faded before something far rarer than outrage stirred in the room. Conscience. At first there was only silence, the kind that hangs heavy after something unspoken finally breaks into the open. But then quietly, almost reluctantly, a Republican congressman stood. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't clear his throat for drama. He simply rose slowly, as if the weight of the moment pressed on every joint. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried. It cut clean through the tension, like a thread pulled tight. This chamber owes Representative Crockett more than silence. It wasn't a flourish. It wasn't a political move. It was what happens when someone realizes that neutrality, in a room built on injustice, is just another form of surrender. The gallery didn't erupt, but every eye in the room turned, because in a place addicted to spectacle, integrity was rare enough to sound like thunder. Across the aisle, a lone independent lawmaker leaned forward, his pen tapping once against the folder before him. He flipped it open, spoke into the mic without waiting for permission, and introduced language for a new rules amendment, a ban on veiled personal attacks, coded slurs, and weaponized decorum. He didn't say Green's name, but he didn't have to. Everyone knew. The suggestion wasn't radical, it was overdue. But what made it seismic was the timing, not whispered in committee or buried in red tape, but dropped like a stone into the still surface of a live hearing that had just become something far larger than its agenda. A procedural motion had never felt so much like a moral declaration. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained standing, not triumphant, not smug, but composed, like the eye of the storm refusing to move even as the system shifted around her. Her arms stayed at her sides, her breathing never quickened, but her presence filled the room more powerfully than any outburst ever could. She didn't need to smile. She didn't need to speak, because the truth didn't need decoration. It only needed daylight. And that's what she had delivered. She had exposed not just a person, but a pattern. Not just a comment, but a culture. And the room, finally quietly, had started to listen. In the days and weeks that would follow, the headlines would focus on the footage, the fallout, the political implications. But those who were in the room that day would remember something else. They would remember the moment when power didn't roar, but stood still. They would remember a woman who didn't raise her voice, but raised a mirror. And they would remember the silence that finally gave way, not to applause, but to accountability. Jasmine didn't win because she dominated. She won because she endured, because she refused to sit down, soften, or shrink, because she met power with presence, not volume. And in a chamber that had spent decades defining professional as polished compliance, she redefined it in real time as truth spoken without permission. And as the hearing adjourned with no gavel strike, no curtain drop, just the quiet reshaping of the room itself, the real storm was only beginning, and this time, it wasn't confined to four walls. Within hours, the footage hit every screen in America. First, it spread quietly, shared by aides, journalists, and students who had watched the hearing live. Then it detonated. Edits were clipped, captions added. Loops of Jasmine Crockett's steady voice facing down fury replayed across TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. News anchors interrupted scheduled coverage to rerun the moment Green stormed out. But more importantly, the moment Jasmine didn't move. The clip of her declaring, "If that's what unprofessional means, then I'll wear it every day like a badge," amassed over 30 million views in 2 days. But the internet didn't just watch it, they responded. Within 48 hours, the hashtag number redefining professional surged to the top of global trends. It wasn't just a trend, it was a reckoning, a movement, a call. Black women across professions began sharing their own stories of being told to smile more, of being called aggressive for speaking directly, of being passed over for not being a culture fit. Lawyers posted clips of Jasmine's speech next to their own courtroom transcripts. Teachers pinned her quotes on classroom walls. Nurses, journalists, corporate analysts, flight attendants, coders, baristas, people in every walk of life began using the hashtag to reclaim a term that had long been used to gatekeep, exclude, and silence. Jasmine hadn't just spoken truth to power, she had redefined what power could look and sound like. For the first time, professional wasn't being measured in posture or tone, but in courage, in clarity, in how much of yourself you refuse to shrink. Universities took notice. Invitations flooded her inbox. From Yale, Georgetown, Stanford, Howard. Panels were rearranged. Entire symposiums were reframed around her testimony. At Harvard Law School, a class canceled its lecture just to watch the hearing replay in full, frame by frame. CNN booked her for a primetime segment where she sat alone in a minimalist studio, no flag behind her, no podium, just a single camera and a chair. The host asked her what she thought professionalism truly meant, now that her face had become its most debated definition. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She looked straight into the lens and said, "Professionalism is not submission. It's conviction." The line rolled through the country like a second shockwave. Clips of that one sentence hit 1 million shares before the segment had even finished airing. It became a slogan, a t-shirt, a protest sign, a pinned tweet. But more than that, it became a mirror. Because as people watched Jasmine stand her ground, watched her silence a room without shouting, watched her face down condescension without ever lowering her gaze, they saw more than a congresswoman. They saw themselves. The teenager told to speak softer in debate club. The job applicant told her natural hair was distracting. The young man passed over in meetings, then asked to lead diversity training. The professor who had to defend her tone more often than her thesis. The mother who had to fight for her child's IEP in a district office filled with closed smiles. They all saw her, not as a symbol, but as proof. Proof that you could hold the line, proof that you could be calm and still be fierce, that you could be composed and still burn down a system with truth alone. And so the clip kept playing, not because it was trending, because it was needed, because sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do isn't to scream or storm, but to stay, to speak, and to make silence your stage. Jasmine Crockett had done just that, and a nation finally stopped talking long enough to listen. And after days of headlines, interviews, and a nation shaken by a single moment of stillness, Jasmine returned, not to relive the battle, but to deliver its final word. She stepped back into the same hearing room where it all began. Same marble floor, same oak-paneled walls, same ceiling that once felt too heavy to stand under. But something was different now. Not the architecture, not the lighting. It was the air. It no longer resisted her presence. It made room for it. Lawmakers straightened when she walked in, not from protocol, but from something closer to awareness. Her heels didn't echo, they declared. She moved to the front not like someone revisiting a memory, but like someone fulfilling a sentence that had waited too long to be spoken. She carried no stack of papers, no binder, just her voice. And when she stood behind the microphone, there was no tremor in her breath, no hesitation in her shoulders. She paused, not for silence, but to let the weight settle. Then, with the same calm that once disarmed a chamber mid-attack, she spoke. "If being professional means knowing my plate," she began, her eyes sweeping the room with quiet defiance, "then I'll proudly be unprofessional." The line didn't just land, it detonated. It sliced clean through the legacy of every closed-door meeting where that word had been used to shut someone like her out. Through every performance review coated with dog whistles, through every hallway whisper about who didn't fit the culture. It exposed professionalism not as a standard, but a script. And Jasmine had just torn it up, live, in the very place that wrote it. For a second, there was no response. No one moved, not because they didn't hear her, but because they did. Every syllable, every unspoken history underneath it. The stillness was not resistance, it was surrender. And then, like the final tremor after an earthquake, the applause erupted. Not polite, not restrained. It broke like a dam. From every corner of the room, hands came together with the urgency of something long overdue. Some stood, some didn't. But every clap sounded like more than agreement. It sounded like release. The kind that only comes when a room has been holding its breath for too long. There were no chants, no signs, just raw, open sound, honest, loud, unashamed. And still, Jasmine didn't smile. Her face remained steady, her eyes locked forward. Not cold, just clear. Because this wasn't about celebration. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reality finally being spoken so plainly, so powerfully, that even the walls had no choice but to listen. The camera zoomed in, slow, deliberate, not on the crowd, not on the chair's gavel, but on Jasmine. Her expression didn't shift with the roar behind her. She didn't beam or blink back tears. Her lips remained pressed in quiet resolution, her brow unmoved. And in that moment, every viewer watching at home saw something undeniable. She had not won because her opponent collapsed. She had won because she never did. She had withstood what was meant to belittle her, contain her, break her, and she had done it without screaming, without flinching, without surrendering a single inch of her integrity. The power of the moment wasn't in her volume. It was in her refusal to be silenced. Behind her, a few aides wiped their eyes. Some lawmakers leaned in toward each other, whispering thoughts they weren't yet brave enough to speak aloud. One reporter lowered her notepad and simply watched, no longer documenting, just witnessing. The applause continued, rolling and receding like waves, but Jasmine never lifted her arms to acknowledge it. She didn't soak it in. She didn't need to, because she hadn't come for applause. She had come for closure, for clarity, and for every person who had ever been told their voice didn't belong in rooms like this. She gave them proof. She had walked into a chamber designed to drain dignity from people like her. She had stood under lights meant to expose weakness, not truth. She had faced down interruptions, insults, and centuries of coded expectations, without ever becoming what they accused her of being. And when the moment came to define who she didn't point fingers. She didn't shout anyone down. She redefined the word they had tried to weaponize, and she did it in their own language, in their own house. And now as she stood there, camera lens focused so tight the world could count her breath, she didn't just look like the future. She looked like justice finally finding its voice. The applause inside the chamber didn't stop quickly. It didn't fade politely. It swelled, then held. A rolling tide of recognition, not for drama, but for truth. But Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her hand, didn't gesture for more. She remained motionless behind the microphone, her eyes steady, her jaw still set with the resolve that had carried her through every second of that hearing. She had spoken her final line not as a flourish, but as a declaration carved in steel. "I'll proudly be unprofessional." She didn't look like a woman who had won. She looked like a woman who had nothing left to prove. Outside the building, however, something else was happening. Something harder to track, more explosive than anything within the room. The live streams had ended, but the clips had already begun to move, like electricity on an open wire, like a pulse breaking loose across a network built to contain, but never control, emotion. On social media, within 15 minutes of her closing statement, the hashtag number redefining professional was trending globally. Within an hour, it was etched onto handmade cardboard signs in New York subways, college campuses in Los Angeles, coffee shop chalkboards in Austin, and office Slack threads in Chicago. People weren't just reposting Jasmine's speech, they were pairing it with their own stories. A nurse in Atlanta posted, "They said my braids weren't professional. I wore them anyway." Redefining professional, a black woman in London added, "They said I spoke too directly in meetings. I just got promoted." Redefining professional, a 17-year-old high school debater wrote, "They said my voice was too deep for public speaking. I just got into Stanford." Redefining professional, within 24 hours, Jasmine's words had ceased to be a moment. They had become a mirror, and millions of people were finally seeing themselves in it. In a university lounge at Spelman College, a group of students sat around a cracked laptop watching the replay of the hearing. No one spoke for the first 10 minutes. Then one woman said, "I've been called that exact word, unprofessional, by a man who never remembered my name." Another nodded, eyes locked on the screen, voice flat. "They used that word to shut me down when I challenged our department's lack of diversity." Another, "It's not a word, it's a muzzle." But something was different this time. As they watched Jasmine stand, not yelling, not folding, just standing, something in them unlocked. The word no longer belonged to their supervisors, professors, or critics. It had been taken back, redefined, out loud, on the record. That same afternoon, in an elementary school in Detroit, a fifth-grade teacher paused the lesson and played a short clip of Jasmine's speech on the projector. She didn't explain it, just let the children hear the cadence, the calm, the fire inside the words. One student, barely 10, whispered to his friend, "She sounds like my mom when she's fighting the school for my IEP." Another girl looked up and said softly, "She talks like me." Like she's not sorry. The teacher didn't cry until later, in the break room, after the students had gone to recess. That was when she texted her sister, "Our voice sounds different when it's not apologizing for existing." Newsrooms scrambled to keep up. CNN edited the full hearing into a special segment before nightfall. MSNBC ran a primetime panel titled, "The Power of Standing Still: Why Jasmine Crockett Broke the Internet." Even usually conservative outlets were forced to acknowledge the scale of the moment, not because they agreed, but because their viewers were already asking, what exactly did she say? But no one said it better than Jasmine herself when she appeared the next night, unscripted, alone, on a CNN special hosted by Abby Phillip. In a studio stripped of fanfare, Jasmine sat across from the host, back straight, eyes focused. There were no dramatic cuts, just two women, one camera, and a single question. "Congresswoman Crockett, what does professionalism mean to you now?" Jasmine paused only a second, then said, "Professionalism is not submission. It's conviction." The feed cut to silence. Abby didn't speak. The control room didn't add music. There was no panel to comment afterward. Just the image of Jasmine, steady and still, her voice echoing through every living room like a bell tolling over a quiet city. That clip, 38 seconds long, was viewed over 50 million times in less than 2 days. Back in her district office in Texas, Jasmine received over 10,000 emails in 72 hours. Most didn't begin with "Dear Representative." They began with "Thank you." A woman who had left law school 10 years earlier because a professor told her she lacked polish wrote, "I'm reapplying." A transgender man who had been let go from his first job for inappropriate tone wrote, "You made space for me and I've never met you." A father who had watched the hearing with his daughter wrote, "She asked me if she could be loud when she knows she's right. I told her yes, and I have you to thank." This wasn't virality. This was velocity, movement, culture bending, language being reclaimed in real time. And Jasmine? She didn't go on a victory tour. She didn't hold press conferences or post selfies with talking heads. She went back to work, quietly, purposefully, because she knew the real change hadn't happened when she spoke, but when other people started speaking because of her. And she knew applause is loud, but transformation is slow. So she let the echo live on its own, knowing that the most powerful line she ever delivered was the one people now whispered to themselves in boardrooms, in classrooms, and in mirrors. If being professional means knowing my place, then I'll proudly be unprofessional. And from that moment forward, no one could ever use that word the same way again. The flood didn't just wash over the people, it reached the powerful too. And for many of them, it came like a cold slap in a room they thought they owned. Inside the Capitol, Jasmine's testimony had landed like a precision strike. But what followed wasn't an explosion. It was slower, colder, and far more devastating. It was accountability. And it moved through the marble corridors of power like smoke through air vents. Inescapable, untraceable, and impossible to ignore. The first sign came not from her supporters, but from those who had remained stone-faced during the hearing. A Republican congressman from Ohio, who had spent most of Jasmine's testimony checking his phone, released a carefully worded statement 3 days later. While I may disagree with Representative Crockett's positions, I recognize the validity of her call for decorum to be applied fairly. It was soft, toothless. But in D.C., even a mild acknowledgement can feel like a collapse. Others were not so lucky. An anonymous staffer from Green's office leaked internal memos to a political blog, emails that showed Green's team had planned the interruption days in advance. Subject line, handle Crockett before she builds steam. One of the messages referred to Jasmine as a tick-tock trap waiting to happen. Another line read, we poke. She explodes. She loses. But she hadn't exploded. She had stood. And now the receipts were public. Within hours, the leak was verified by major outlets. The story made front-page headlines. Marjorie Taylor Greene plotted disruption of Jasmine Crockett. Hearing backfires nationally. Editorial boards that had remained neutral began scrambling for position. The New York Times published a rare op-ed titled, The Weaponization of Decorum, How Congress Has Used Civility to Silence Women. The Washington Post ran a front-page headline, Crockett was interrupted. She interrupted a culture. And in offices around the Hill, people who had once laughed quietly into their sleeves now stared at closed doors and blinking phones. One senator's aide whispered, she changed the temperature of the building. Another, a junior policy advisor, told a colleague in the hallway, this is the first time I've seen people afraid of being called out without being yelled at. But it wasn't fear, it was exposure. The House Oversight Committee, the very body where Jasmine had been attacked, suddenly found itself under the microscope. Civil rights groups demanded a full audit of past interruptions and conduct violations in hearings. In the span of 5 days, over 200 clips were pulled from C-SPAN archives. A pattern emerged, and it was damning. Interruptions of female representatives, disproportionately high. Interruptions of women of color, off the charts. One clip showed Greene interrupting Representative Ayanna Pressley mid-sentence. Another revealed a Republican lawmaker sighing and rolling his eyes every time Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez opened her mic. A new montage was born, not created by activists, but by a data journalism unit at a major network. Its title, Silencing in Real Time. Suddenly, those who had dismissed Jasmine's moment as emotional theatrics were forced to answer for their own records. And the hearings didn't stop. Neither did Jasmine. 2 days after the CNN interview, she returned to the Capitol. Not for interviews, but for work. The same hallways, the same carpet. The same men who once brushed past her now made awkward eye contact in elevators. Some even nodded. A few apologized. Not in public, but in low voices when no camera was present. It wasn't about regret. It was about self-preservation. Because what Jasmine had done was bigger than one exchange. She had shifted the margins of what was acceptable and made silence look like guilt. On the 7th day after the hearing, a vote was held. A symbolic one called by an independent member to propose a reform in the committee's procedural guidelines. The proposal was simple. banned the use of identity-coded language as personal attacks. Phrases like, "you people," "angry," "out of control," "loud," when used without relevance to policy, would be ruled as violations. During the discussion, several members who had previously sided with Green remained silent, but one, a conservative moderate from Arizona, stood and said something no one expected. "I came here thinking the word unprofessional was harmless. Last week I watched it used like a blade, and I watched someone stand through it without bleeding. That changed something in me." The resolution passed, not unanimously but powerfully. It wasn't just about rules. It was about acknowledgement, about the fact that words aren't neutral when they're designed to wound without leaving visible scars. Jasmine never claimed victory. She never took a victory lap. She let the truth do that for her. And yet, her influence echoed in the most unlikely places. A former Republican press secretary posted a thread on X, formerly Twitter. "I helped write talking points to call people like Jasmine divisive. I was wrong. I see it now. She didn't divide, she revealed." Cable news began referring to her exchange as a turning point in legislative culture. Scholars began to cite it in classrooms. One political science professor at Yale opened his lecture by playing Jasmine's full speech and asking the class, "Where does professionalism end and power begin?" Even in Green's own district, the backlash had begun. Town halls were no longer entirely friendly. Voters asked questions. Women stood up and asked her to explain herself. One even wore a shirt that said, "Loud, unapologetic, unbroken." The old playbook, interrupt, enrage, discredit, had failed, and in its place stood a new archetype, steady, honest, undeniable. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her fist. She didn't slam the desk. She didn't walk out. She stayed. She stood. She spoke. And now even those who once smirked behind closed doors were saying her name, not because they had changed their values, but because she had forced them to change their behavior. This wasn't justice delivered by applause. This was a reckoning written in real time, in transcripts, in rules, in rewired minds, and it had only just begun. It didn't happen in a flash of lights or behind a podium. There was no banner, no confetti, no official proclamation, but a symbol had been born. 7 days after the hearing, Jasmine Crockett stood in a modest gymnasium in the 5th Ward of Houston. It was the kind of space where folding chairs always outnumbered working microphones, where the heat clung to your skin, no matter how many fans clicked overhead. There were no press passes, no handlers, just kids, about 200 of them, stuffed into plastic seats, backpacks under chairs, eyes shifting between curiosity and quiet awe. No one there cared that her face had been on CNN. They hadn't come for the soundbite. They'd come because someone had finally made the word professional sound like something they could touch. Jasmine didn't walk to the front like a politician. She walked like a teacher. No teleprompter, no written speech, just her voice, her feet, and the weight of everything she'd carried into that moment. She began simply. "I wasn't invited here to lecture you," she said, pacing slowly in front of the first row. "I'm not here to tell you to behave. I'm here to tell you what they mean when they say that word, professional." She paused. "Because they'll use it on you." The room held still. Even the squeak of sneakers and shifting backpacks faded away. "They won't always throw chairs at you," Jasmine continued. "They won't always curse you out loud. Sometimes they'll just call you unprofessional and wait for you to believe it." A slow hush overtook the gym. Eyes widened. Posture straightened. They'll tell you your braids are distracting, that your voice is too loud, that your questions are too sharp, that your confidence makes people uncomfortable. They won't say the real words. They'll say, "Not a good fit, needs polish, doesn't carry herself the right way." She stopped, dead center under the basketball hoop, and looked every student dead in the eye. "They will not always hit you, but they will measure you, slice by slice, until you stop showing up as yourself." Then she smiled. Not the practiced smile of a candidate, the quiet, knowing smile of someone who had walked through the fire and kept walking. And when they do that, you don't yell, you don't cry. She leaned forward just slightly. You say noted. Now watch me do it anyway. The gym didn't erupt. It transformed. Because it wasn't a rally. It was a passing of the torch. Later that night, Jasmine sat on a worn metal bench behind the school with the principal and three teachers. The sun was sliding low, casting burnt orange shadows across the asphalt. She got through to them, one of the teachers said. I've been trying to teach them about resilience all year, and she did it in 8 minutes. The principal nodded slowly, still watching the empty court. It's not the words, Ernie said. It's the fact she didn't flinch. Jasmine, still holding a water bottle from the gym, didn't respond right away. She just stared out at the playground. I flinched once, she said quietly. 8 years ago, when a white judge called me loud and asked if I had ever taken a breath before speaking. I smiled and said thank you. She exhaled. I've been mad at myself ever since. She looked at the principal then, her voice firmer. So now I don't smile, not unless I mean it. Across the country, the impact deepened. In a university women's studies class in North Carolina, Jasmine's hearing was now part of the syllabus. The course title was updated to include a new module, Language, Power, and the Silent Rebellion. In a courtroom in Oakland, a public defender cited her in a closing argument about bias and how tone is policed. A black professor in Kansas walked into her first faculty meeting of the semester with a tote bag that read, "Proudly unprofessional." When asked about it, she simply replied, "If you know, you know." The movement had evolved beyond Jasmine. She had become a vessel, not because she asked to be one, but because the culture needed one. Art students painted murals, activists printed buttons, high school students quoted her in commencement speeches. But none of it looked like hero worship. It looked like people finally hearing themselves in a voice that didn't apologize. Then came the moment no one expected. 3 weeks after the hearing, Jasmine was invited to deliver the closing keynote at a judicial ethics symposium in New York City, an event that historically had never once featured a woman of color as a headliner. She almost declined. It's not my crowd, she told her staff. They're not coming to hear me. They're coming to feel less implicated. But after a long silence, she agreed. The hall was high-ceilinged, the chairs velvet, the audience filled with judges, law professors, and veteran attorneys. Most of them white, most of them male, many of them skeptics. Jasmine walked to the podium, no script in hand. I've been asked to speak today about what it means to uphold the law, she began. But I think we need to talk about what it means to be heard in rooms where law is shaped. She spoke for 12 minutes. She never raised her voice. But by the end, no one looked away. Her closing line? The law should not require silence to be taken seriously. The room stood, not out of politics, but out of reckoning. By then, the movement had taken on a life of its own. Jasmine didn't need to push it. She didn't need to trend. Her words lived in the marrow of those who had once been measured in silence. She hadn't just redefined a word. She had rewritten what it meant to belong without asking. And that is how a legacy begins. Not with statues or slogans, not with a headline, but with a moment where someone finally refuses to bend, and others realize they never had to either. And as the world echoed with her words, as silence cracked and definitions crumbled, one truth stood taller than any headline. This was never just about one woman. There are moments that make noise, and then there are moments that leave marks. Jasmine Crockett's stand did both. But in the end, the sound faded. The headlines rolled on. What remained was something deeper, a scar that taught, not just hurt. And that scar became a question we all had to confront, whether seated in Congress or behind a checkout counter, whether teaching classrooms or surviving them. Who gets to define what power looks like, and why have we let them do it for so long? This story wasn't about a clash of politics. It was about proximity to pain, about how close someone has to get to injustice before they're labeled unprofessional for naming it. Jasmine didn't walk into that hearing to fight. She walked in to speak. And the moment she spoke plainly, calmly, without bowing her head or softening her truth, the room turned on her, not with violence, but with a quieter, crueler force, decorum. A word that pretends to be neutral, when in reality it is always bent toward comfort, but never hers. That's the heart of it. This wasn't a story about civility. It was a story about control. And in that story lies the lesson. We live in a world where some people's fire is called passion, and others is labeled aggression, where assertiveness on one tongue is leadership, and on another it's threat. Jasmine didn't break the rules. She revealed how those rules were written to break her. That's what made it radical. That's what made it necessary. She forced us to see what it looks like when a system designed for compliance is confronted by someone who knows their worth too deeply to shrink. She didn't just fight back. She made stillness an act of resistance. She made a calm tone feel like a revolution. And in doing so, she reminded us of a truth far older than Congress, older than microphones, older even than law. Power is not about volume, it's about conviction. But the greater truth, the one harder to digest, is that we helped build the world that tried to silence her. Every time we laughed when a woman was called too much, every time we didn't speak up when someone was interrupted, every time we nodded when someone told us she'd be easier to work with if she smiled more, these weren't small moments, they were bricks. And the walls they built have kept out more truth than any policy ever could. Jasmine didn't dismantle that wall in one day, but she cracked it, and now it leaks. Now we know that silence is not neutrality, it's complicity. That professional should never mean invisible. That rules written without us were never meant to protect us. That we do not owe our dignity to the comfort of others. And now we know this too. The quietest room can become the loudest battlefield. The most dangerous word isn't shouted, it's whispered. And the strongest weapon a woman can wield is simply standing her ground and refusing to ask for permission. So what is the lesson? That change doesn't come when we scream louder. It comes when we speak without apology, when we name the wound and hold the stare, when we remind the world that there is no wrong way to be honest, no wrong tone for truth, no wrong volume for dignity. Jasmine Crockett reminded us of all of that, and now the only question left is, when it's your turn to speak, will you lower your voice to be accepted, or will you stand up, breathe in, and let the room adjust to your presence? And now that the lesson has been carved into the walls of Congress and whispered into the hearts of millions, the silence is broken, but the responsibility remains. This moment was never meant to be an ending. Jasmine Crockett didn't endure humiliation so we could be inspired for a weekend and then return to our routines. Her strength was not a performance, it was a provocation, and her words weren't a message to be admired. They were a command, a demand, a flare fired into the night sky, telling all of us who have ever been silenced, minimized, interrupted, or labeled, you are not wrong for being loud. You are not dangerous for being sharp. And you are not unprofessional for being unapologetically yourself. So what do we do with that fire? We do not sit still. We do not repost and move on. We build. We confront. We transform every room Jasmine stood in into a room that listens differently the next time we enter it. Because this fight, the one she lit from a single microphone, is not over. It never was. It lives now in every hallway conversation where a woman is told to soften her voice before her idea is heard, in every teacher evaluation where tone is ranked higher than content, in every job interview where black hair is coded as not polished, in every courtroom, boardroom, classroom, break room, and living room where someone with power uses the word professional not to invite, but to exclude. This is where the real test begins. You want to honor Jasmine? Don't clap. Don't quote her. Do what she did. When the easy thing is silence, speak. When the polite thing is to excuse it, name it. When the safe thing is to avoid it, step into it. And when the powerful call you unprofessional, make that the badge you wear into battle. Because if Jasmine's stand taught us anything, it's that you don't have to shout to shake the system. You don't have to scream to split the truth wide open. Sometimes all it takes is standing so still that the room finally hears what it's been trying to ignore. But standing still doesn't mean standing alone. You reading this, are standing in a room too. Right now. Maybe it's virtual. Maybe it's cultural. Maybe it's at your workplace, or your school, or your dinner table. Maybe it's the quiet moment when your boss mispronounces your name for the fifth time. Maybe it's the team meeting where someone says, "Let's keep this civil," right after you tell the truth. Maybe it's the friend who rolls their eyes when you say racism isn't subtle, it's systemic. In those moments, you will be tempted to shrink, to smile and stay palatable, to smooth your truth into something digestible. Don't. Stand. Not for drama, not for revenge. Stand because the ground beneath you was already earned by someone else's defiance. Stand because someone in that room needs to see it's possible. Stand because silence has never saved anyone, but truth, when spoken boldly, has moved nations. Jasmine Crockett didn't burn down the hearing room. She didn't need to. She became the match and dared the world to catch fire. Now it's your turn. Ask yourself, what will I do the next time someone uses tone to dismiss truth? What will I say when someone mistakes power for threat? What will I risk to make one more room safe for someone who speaks like me, looks like me, dares like me? Because there is no neutral here. You're either the silence or you're the signal. So speak up, not because it's easy, but because it's right. Disrupt, not because you want attention, but because injustice deserves none. Be unprofessional, if professional means quiet while others are erased. Be out of line, if the line was drawn to keep you out. Be too much, if being less means watching people suffer in polite silence. And if they try to shame you with that word, like they did to her, if they tell you to fall in line, calm down, speak softer, sit back, look them dead in the eye, smile if you must, and say, "I won't lower my voice just to be tolerated. I will raise it until I am heard." Then stand, even if your knees shake, even if your voice cracks, even if the room rolls its eyes or shifts uncomfortably in its seats. Because somewhere out there, another person is watching, maybe younger than you, maybe braver than you, maybe more scared than you, and they're waiting to see what you'll do. So show them what Jasmine showed you. That being unprofessional isn't the insult, it's the invitation to rebuild everything that tried to erase you, to reclaim every word that was used against you, to rise and make the room listen, whether it wants to or not. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.